The dust hung in the air like a veil, obscuring the harsh reality of Copper Creek in the summer of 1887. The Arizona Territory was unforgiving, a place where dreams withered under the scorching sun as readily as the sparse vegetation that clung to life along dried creek beds. It was a land that demanded everything and promised nothing in return, a truth Eleanor Campbell understood all too well. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flood had come without warning 3 weeks prior, a wall of water tearing through the valley with such force that it seemed as if the very earth was being reclaimed by some vengeful god. When the waters receded, they left nothing but mud and memories where Ellie's home had once stood. Her parents, her younger brother, the small farm they had painstakingly built over 5 years, all gone in a single night of nature's fury. Now she stood at the edge of Copper Creek, a ghost of a person with nothing but the clothes on her back and her grandmother's tattered book of herbal remedies clutched to her chest. Her hair, once the color of sun-ripened wheat, hung in dirty strands around her hollow face. Her dress, borrowed from the church charity box, hung loosely on her frame, a constant reminder of how much she had lost. In town, they didn't even call her by name anymore. She was simply the Flood Girl, an uncomfortable reminder of how fragile their own lives were. "Can't keep feeding you, miss," Martha Wilson said, her voice not unkind but firm as she wiped down the counter of her general store. "Charity's running thin these days. Perhaps you ought to consider the offer from Widow Jensen. She needs help with her washing." Ellie nodded, though the thought of spending her days elbow-deep in lye soap made her stomach clench. It wasn't pride. She was long past that, but the knowledge that such work would destroy her hands, the one tool she needed most for her herbal work. "I appreciate all you've done, Mrs. Wilson," she replied softly, her voice scratchy from disuse. "I'll find my way." Ellie didn't know how long she had been walking when she first saw the dust cloud on the horizon. The summer heat shimmered off, the parched ground making the approaching riders waver like apparitions. Perhaps they were, she thought grimly. Perhaps she had finally succumbed to the heat, and death was coming to claim her like it had claimed her family. But death didn't ride a magnificent black stallion, nor did it have piercing eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. Death didn't wear a tailored suit despite the desert heat or command, a dozen men with nothing more than a gesture. The riders slowed as they approached, and Ellie stood her ground, too exhausted to run, too numb to fear. The man on the black stallion pulled ahead of the others, his gaze calculating as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice as dry as the land around them. Ellie looked around at the empty expanse. "On what?" Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that she would question him. "Blackwood land, everything from Copper Creek to Painted Canyon." "Then I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, gathering what little dignity she had left. "I'll be on my way." She turned to leave, though she had no destination in mind. Behind her, she heard muted conversations, the men's voices carrying on the still air. "That's one of the flood survivors," someone said. "Campbell family. Nothing left." "She looks half dead," another observed. "Won't make it to sundown in this heat." Ellie kept walking, each step more difficult than the last. The sun beat down mercilessly, and dark spots began to dance at the edges of her vision. She didn't hear the hoofbeats approaching until the shadow fell across her. "Miss Campbell." She turned, swaying slightly. Victor Blackwood sat rigidly on his stallion, his expression inscrutable. "You have knowledge of herbs, medicines?" The question surprised her. "Yes, my grandmother taught me." He nodded once, sharply. "My ranch is short a healer. Previous one died last winter, Position includes room and board. It wasn't a request, or even an offer. It was a statement of fact. Before she could formulate a response, he continued, "Samuel will escort you." He gestured to a weathered man on a dun-colored horse. "The wagon is half a mile back. It will take you to the ranch." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Ellie staring after him in disbelief. The man called Samuel's side and extended a canteen. "Best drink, miss? It's a long ride to Blackwood Ranch, and the boss doesn't make offers twice." "That was an offer?" Ellie asked, taking a cautious sip of water. Samuel's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement, near as it comes with him. She had no name in this new place. She was simply the Healer, a title that came with suspicious glances and whispered conversations that abruptly ended when she entered a room. Blackwood Ranch sprawled across the landscape like its own kingdom, a sprawling main house built in the Spanish style, surrounded by bunkhouses, stables, and outbuildings. Her quarters were small but clean, attached to a larger room filled with dried herbs, tinctures, and medical supplies. The previous healer had kept meticulous records, but many of the shelves were bare, the supplies depleted. "You'll need to restock," Josephine said brusquely as she showed Ellie around on that first day. The housekeeper was a stern woman with silver-streaked black hair pulled tightly back from her face. "Mr. Blackwood expects the infirmary to be fully operational at all times." "I'll need to gather herbs," Ellie replied, already cataloguing what was missing. "Are there gardens?" "Gardens?" Josephine's laugh was short and sharp. "Girl, this is cattle country. We've got grazing land and water. Holes. You want herbs, you'll have to find them yourself." That evening, as Ellie sat alone in her room, the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. She was alive, yes, but was this living? Claimed like property by a man who hadn't even asked her name, expected to serve people who viewed her with suspicion at best. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, a young ranch hand stood there, hat clutched in his hands, his face pale beneath his tan. "Ma'am, it's Torres. Got thrown from his horse. He's bad hurt." Just like that, Ellie Campbell disappeared entirely, and the healer emerged. She grabbed her grandmother's book and followed the young man to the bunkhouse, where a crowd had gathered around a prone figure. "Give him air," she commanded, surprised at the authority in her own voice. The men parted immediately. The injured man's leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped from a gash on his forehead. Ellie knelt beside him, hands already moving, to assess the damage. "I need clean water, bandages, and my kit from the infirmary," she said, not looking up, "and 2 straight branches for splinting." To her surprise, the men scrambled to obey. As she worked, setting the broken bone and cleaning the head wound, she was vaguely aware of a tall figure watching from the doorway. Victor Blackwood observed, in silence, his face unreadable, before disappearing back into the night. By the time she finished, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. Torres was sleeping, his legs splinted and his wounds cleaned and dressed. The other ranch hands had long since returned to their bunks, but Samuel Reed remained, his back against the wall, watching her work. "You did good," he said simply as she packed up her supplies. "Boss was right about you." Ellie was too tired to decipher what that meant. She nodded wearily and made her way back to her quarters, collapsing onto her bed fully clothed. She woke to the sound of voices outside her window. "Don't see why we need some flood stray," a man was saying, his voice low but clear in the still afternoon air. "Probably bring bad luck." "She set Torres' leg clean as any doctor," another voice replied. "Would have lost him otherwise." "Still, boss bringing her here without so much as asking. It ain't right. Since when does Victor Blackwood ask permission for anything on his own land?" Ellie closed her eyes, their words confirming what she already knew. She was here on sufferance, a charity case picked up like a stray dog along the roadside. The Knowledge should have stung, but she was beyond such hurts now. She had shelter, food and purpose, more than she'd had yesterday, more than many had in this harsh land. The days fell into a pattern. Ellie rose early, checking on any patients in the infirmary before venturing out to search for herbs in the scrubland surrounding the ranch. The land was surprisingly generous once you knew where to look. Desert sage grew in abundance along the rocky outcrops. Wild yucca offered both food and fiber, and in the shadowy recesses of Painted Canyon, she found hanging gardens of medicinal plants nourished by hidden springs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She treated the ranch hand's injuries without complaint. Broken bones from bucking broncos, cuts from barbed wire, burns from campfires. She learned their names and their stories, and gradually the suspicious glances faded. But Victor Blackwood remained an enigma. He appeared at the ranch house only sporadically, spending most of his time riding the boundaries of his vast holdings or locked in his study with ledgers and maps. When their paths crossed, he acknowledged her with a terse nod but little else. It was Josephine who finally offered some insight, her initial frostiness having thawed somewhat over the weeks. "Don't take it personal," the housekeeper said as they prepared dinner one evening. "He's been that way since his wife died. 5 years now, and the man's still more ghost than flesh." "I've heard the men talking about the Prescotts," Ellie ventured, seizing the rare opportunity for information. "They seem concerned." Josephine's hands stilled momentarily. "The Prescott brothers have been trying to push Mr. Blackwood out for years. They want his water rights, his grazing land. They've already swallowed up 3 smaller ranches to the north, and Mr. Blackwood refuses to sell. This land is in his blood," Josephine replied, her voice softening with something like pride. "His father built this ranch from nothing, died defending it. Victor would sooner be buried here than see it fall to the likes of the Prescotts." The first real crisis came a month into Ellie's time at Blackwood Ranch. A group of hands had been mending fences along the northern boundary when they were ambushed. 2 men were killed outright, 3 more wounded severely enough that they couldn't ride. Samuel Reed arrived at the ranch house at dusk, his horse lathered and one of the injured. Men slung across his saddle. "Prescott men," he gasped as they helped him dismount. "Caught us by surprise. The others are sheltering in the line cabin, too hurt to move." Victor Blackwood's face hardened into something terrible as he heard the news. "Get the wagon," he ordered. "We're bringing them home." "It'll be dark soon," Samuel warned. "Trail to the line cabin is treacherous enough in daylight." "Then we'd best hurry." Victor turned to Ellie, who was already examining the wounded man. "What do you need?" She rattled off a list of supplies, surprised when Victor himself helped. "Gather them." As they loaded the wagon, he beckoned to several ranch hands. "Armstrong, Davis, Erickson, rifles and ammunition. We're likely to have unwelcome company." Ellie climbed into the back of the wagon without being asked, her medical kit clutched tightly in her hands. Victor raised an eyebrow but didn't object. The journey to the line cabin was harrowing. The trail wound through Painted Canyon, barely visible in the fading light. Twice they had to stop to clear fallen rocks from the path. Victor drove the team with grim determination, his jaw set in a hard line. "Why would they attack your men?" Ellie asked during one such stop, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Victor's hands stilled on the reins. "Because men like the Prescotts only understand force. They've been moving boundary markers, diverting streams, intimidating smaller ranches into selling. I'm the last obstacle between them and controlling the entire northern valley. And that's worth killing for." His eyes, when they met hers, were cold. "In this country, water is more valuable than gold. The Prescotts know that as well as I do." They reached the line cabin well after midnight. The wounded men were in bad shape, one with a bullet lodged in his shoulder, another with a deep gash across his ribs, the third delirious with fever from an infected arm wound. Ellie worked through the night, removing the bullet by lamplight and stitching wounds, with hands steady despite her exhaustion. Victor remained in the cabin, his rifle across his knees, as he kept watch at the window. Occasionally she would glance up to find his eyes on her, observing her work with that same inscrutable expression. Dawn brought no relief. As they prepared to load the wounded men into the wagon, a shot rang out, splintering the doorframe inches from Ellie's head. "Get down!" Victor shouted, pulling her roughly to the floor as more shots followed. The ranch hands returned fire, the small cabin filling with acrid gun smoke. Through a gap in the shutters, Ellie could make out figures moving among the rocks on the ridge above. "Prescott's men!" she gasped. "Most likely," Victor replied grimly, reloading his rifle. "They must have followed Samuel yesterday. What do they want?" His smile was cold. "Me. Dead, preferably." Hours passed in a tense standoff. The wounded men needed to be moved, but stepping outside meant certain death. As noon approached, the heat inside the cabin became unbearable. One of the wounded men began to seize, his fever spiking dangerously. "I need to get him cooled down," Ellie said urgently, "and the others need proper care, not this." She gestured, helplessly at their makeshift bandages, already soaked through. Victor studied her face for a long moment, then turned to Samuel. "There's a back trail through the canyon. Barely wide enough for a horse, certainly not the wagon. If we create a diversion, you might be able to get the healer and the wounded men out that way." Samuel nodded grimly. "Worth a try." "No," Ellie protested. "I'm not leaving you here to die." "This isn't a discussion, Miss Campbell," Victor said, coldly. "You have patients to attend to, and leaving you to face those men alone helps how, exactly?" she countered, surprising herself with her boldness. "If they want you dead as you say, then the moment we leave, they'll storm this cabin and finish the job." He stared at her, clearly unused to being contradicted. "Do you have a better suggestion?" "As a matter of fact, I do." Ellie opened her medical kit and withdrew a small cloth pouch. "Smoke signals. My father learned the technique from a Navajo man who saved his life during a blizzard. If there are other Blackwood men within sight of the canyon rim, they'll see it and know something's wrong." Victor's expression changed, the cold mask slipping to reveal something like respect. "It could work, but we'd need to get to higher ground, and that means crossing open territory." "Not necessarily," Ellie said. "The chimney." 20 minutes later, Samuel was carefully feeding strips of fabric soaked in one of Ellie's herbal mixtures into the cabin's small fireplace. The resulting smoke, thick, black, and pungent, billowed from the chimney in distinctive bursts. "My father said 3 short, 3 long, 3 short," Ellie explained, her eyes watering from the smoke that filled the cabin despite their efforts to control it. "It's an old distress pattern." Victor said nothing, but his gaze lingered on, her face with an intensity that made her look away. The rescue, when it came, was swift and overwhelming. A dozen Blackwood men appeared on the ridge opposite the Prescott position, catching the attackers in a deadly crossfire. The shooting was over in minutes, the surviving Prescott men fleeing back toward their own territory. As they finally loaded the wounded onto the wagon for the journey home, Victor approached Ellie. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "You saved lives today," he said finally. "Not just the wounded, all of us." "I did what needed doing," she replied simply, "as did you." Something shifted in his expression then, a subtle change she couldn't quite define. He nodded once and turned away, but not before she caught a glimpse of what might have been admiration in those storm-gray eyes. The journey back to the ranch was quieter, the immediate danger past, but the implications of the attack hanging heavy in the air. War had been declared, and Blackwood Ranch now stood on the precipice of a conflict that had been brewing for years. As they crested the final rise and the ranch buildings came into view, Victor suddenly swayed in his seat, his face alarmingly pale in the afternoon light. "Mr. Blackwood?" Ellie reached out instinctively to steady him. "Are you unwell?" "It's nothing," he replied tersely, straightening with visible effort. "Merely tired." But Ellie had seen enough illness to recognize the signs, the sheen of sweat on his brow, the slight tremor in his hands, the tightness around his mouth that spoke of suppressed pain. This was not a man who was merely tired. This was a man in the grip of something far more serious. She said nothing more, but as they unloaded the wounded at the ranch house, she kept a careful eye on him. Twice more she saw him falter when he thought no one was watching, bracing himself against the wagon as if the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted. That night, after ensuring her patients were stable, Ellie made her way to the main house. Josephine met her at the door, her normally stern face creased with worry. "He won't see a doctor," the housekeeper said without preamble. "Never has, not even when it's bad as this." "How long has he been ill?" Ellie asked, following Josephine up the grand staircase to the second floor. "Years now. Comes and goes. Some days he seems fine, others—" Josephine's voice trailed off. "His father had the same sickness, wasted away to nothing in the end." They stopped outside an imposing oak door at the end of the hallway. Josephine hesitated, her hand on the knob. "He won't thank you for seeing him like this," she warned. "But I'm at my wit's end, and those Prescott vultures are circling. The ranch needs him strong." Inside, the room was dark, save for a single lamp burning low beside the bed. Victor Blackwood lay motionless, his face gray against the white pillows. As Ellie approached, his eyes opened, focusing on her with difficulty. "Miss Campbell," he rasped, "I don't recall requesting your services." "No, you didn't," she agreed, setting down her bag and pressing a hand to his forehead. He was burning with fever. "But as the only medical professional for 20 miles, I'm exercising my professional judgment." A ghost of his usual sardonic smile touched his lips. "Professional judgment, is that what they call insubordination these days?" "Call it what you will," Ellie replied, already mixing a fever-reducing tincture. "But you will drink this, and you will allow me to examine you properly, or I'll have Samuel and 3 other men hold you down while I do it anyway." He stared at her in astonishment, then, surprisingly, laughed. A rough, rusty sound, as if long, unused. "You've developed quite a backbone, Miss Campbell. Far cry from the half-dead girl we found on the road." "Yes, well," she handed him the medicine cup. "Near-death experiences tend to put things in perspective. Now drink." To her amazement, he complied without further argument. As she examined him, recording his symptoms with clinical detachment, she built a picture of his condition that confirmed her worst fears. The recurring fevers, the wasting, the pain that seemed to settle in his joints, these were classic signs of a disease that had taken many lives with no known cure in traditional medicine. But her grandmother's book contained other knowledge, remedies passed down through generations, some dating back to the indigenous peoples who had lived on this land long before European settlers arrived. "I can help manage the symptoms," she told him honestly when she had finished, "but I won't lie to you. This illness is serious." He nodded, unsurprised. "How long?" "That depends on you," she replied. "If you follow my instructions, take the medicines I prepare, and most importantly, rest when your body demands it, you could have years yet. Good years." "And if I don't?" Ellie met his gaze steadily. "Then I give you 6 months. Less if you insist on riding out during ambushes and working yourself to exhaustion. Victor closed his eyes, his expression momentarily unguarded. In that unguarded moment, she saw not the formidable cattle baron who commanded men with a glance, but simply a man, tired, in pain, and facing his own mortality with a courage that made her heart ache. "I need more time," he said finally, so quietly she almost didn't hear. "The ranch, the water rights. If I die now, the Prescotts will take everything. My men, their families. They depend on me." "Then you'll live," Ellie said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "We'll make sure of it." In the weeks that followed, Ellie developed a routine that revolved around Victor Blackwood's care. Each morning before dawn, she would prepare fresh tinctures in the infirmary, then make her way to the main house while the ranch still slumbered. Victor was invariably awake, often sitting at his desk despite her strict instructions about rest. "You're the most difficult patient I've ever had," she told him one morning as she measured out his medicine. "And that includes Torres, who tried to ride with a broken leg." "I have responsibilities," Victor replied, though he accepted the bitter mixture without complaint. "The ranch doesn't run itself." "The ranch won't run at all if you're dead," Ellie countered, her concern making her bold. "Samuel is perfectly capable of managing day-to-day operations." Victor studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You've come to know my men well." "I treat their injuries, mix their medicines, listen to their stories," she said with a small shrug. "People talk to healers. They always have. And what do they say about me?" He asked the question casually, but something in his eyes betrayed genuine curiosity. Ellie hesitated, unsure how to respond. The ranch hand spoke of Victor Blackwood with a mixture of fear, respect, and loyalty that was difficult to articulate. They called him a hard man, but a fair one, demanding but generous to those who earned his trust. "They say you built something worth protecting," she said finally. "That means something in a place where most people are just passing through." He nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with her answer. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Miss Campbell, Ellie." It was the first time he had used her given name. "I've never properly thanked you for what you did at the line cabin. For this," he gestured to the medicine. "You gave me a place when I had none," she replied simply. "We're even." His lips curved in that rare slight smile. "I rather think I'm getting the better end of our arrangement." July blazed across the territory, bringing heat so intense that the very air seemed to shimmer. The creek that gave the town its name dwindled to a trickle, and the ranch hands took to working before dawn and after dusk to avoid the worst of the sun. Despite Ellie's care, Victor's condition worsened with the heat. The fevers came more frequently, leaving him weakened and irritable. It was during one such fever that Ellie first met Richard Prescott. She had gone into town for supplies, a rare trip that she undertook only when necessary. Copper Creek was little more than a dusty main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, but it offered essentials that couldn't be produced on the ranch. As she loaded sacks of flour and sugar into the wagon, a shadow fell across her. "You must be the Blackwood healer I've heard so much about." The man who stood before her was expensively dressed despite the heat, his suit tailored and his boots polished to a high shine. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with eyes that assessed her like a piece of livestock at auction. "Mr. Prescott," she acknowledged, recognizing him from descriptions. "I'm afraid you have the advantage of me." "Richard Prescott." He swept off his hat with an exaggerated flourish. "At your service, ma'am." "I doubt that very much," Ellie replied, coolly. "If you'll excuse me, I need to finish my errands." He stepped closer, blocking her path to the wagon. "I understand Blackwood's been unwell. Terrible shame." A chill ran down Ellie's spine despite the heat. How had he known? They had been careful to keep Victor's condition private, aware of how quickly weakness could be exploited in this unforgiving country. "Mr. Blackwood is in excellent health," she lied smoothly, "though I appreciate your concern." Richard Prescott's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, Miss Campbell. Miss Campbell. We both know that's not true. The man's dying, just like his father before him. It's only a matter of time." Ellie straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "Was there something you wanted, Mr. Prescott? Beyond ghoulishly speculating about my employer's health?" His eyebrows rose at her tone, but his smile remained fixed. "Actually, yes. I wanted to make you an offer. When Blackwood Ranch changes hands, as it inevitably will, you'll need a position. The Prescott Ranch could use someone with your talents." The implication was clear. He expected Victor to die, the ranch to fall, and he was already picking through the remains like a vulture. "How generous of you," she said, not bothering to hide her disdain. "But I'm quite content with my current situation. For now, perhaps." He leaned in, dropping his voice. "But you're a smart woman, Miss Campbell. You must realize you're backing a losing horse. Blackwood is finished, the man and the ranch. When the time comes, remember my offer." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving Ellie shaken and furious. The encounter had confirmed what she already suspected. The Prescotts knew about Victor's illness and were positioning themselves to take advantage of his weakness. The drive back to the ranch gave her time to think. Victor needed to know about the encounter, but she worried about the effect the news would have on his already precarious health. In the end, duty won out over caution. "He knew," she concluded after recounting the meeting to Victor that evening. "Not just that you've been ill, but the nature of the illness. He compared it to your father's." Victor's face was impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. "There's a traitor at Blackwood," he said finally. "Someone feeding information to the Prescotts." "Or it could be town gossip," Ellie suggested. "Martha Wilson sees everything that happens in Copper Creek, and she's not known for her discretion." "Perhaps," Victor didn't sound convinced. "Regardless, we need to accelerate our plans. The water rights hearing is in 3 weeks. If the Prescotts know I'm weakened, they'll push their advantage." "You're in no condition to travel to the territorial capital," Ellie protested. "The journey alone could kill you. Then you'll have to make sure it doesn't," Victor replied with grim determination. "Because I'm going, with or without your blessing. There's too much at stake." The preparations for the journey dominated the next 2 weeks. Victor pushed himself relentlessly, working from dawn until well past dusk to ensure the ranch would run smoothly in his absence. Ellie watched with growing concern as he drove himself to exhaustion each day, undoing much of the progress they had made in managing his condition. "At least let me accompany you," she insisted as they discussed the final arrangements. "The territorial capital is 4 days' ride. You'll need medical attention along the way." "Out of the question," Victor said flatly. "You're needed here. Besides, an unmarried woman traveling alone with a man would cause talk." "I'm a healer attending a patient," Ellie countered, "and I care very little for talk." Victor shook his head, but there was a glint of something like admiration in his eyes. "Your reputation matters to me, even if it doesn't to you. Samuel and 2 of the men will accompany me. I'll take your medicines and follow your instructions." "You haven't followed a single instruction I've given you since I arrived," Ellie retorted, exasperated. His lips twitched. "There's always a first time." The morning of departure arrived with an ominous bank of clouds building on the western horizon. The air felt heavy, charged with the promise of a storm. As the men loaded the last supplies into the wagon, Ellie approached Victor with a leather pouch. "Fresh tinctures," she explained, pressing it into his hands. The green bottle morning and night for the fever, the brown one for pain. The sachet should be brewed as tea if the coughing starts again. Victor nodded, tucking the pouch into his saddlebag. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, both aware that this might be the last time they saw each other. If the journey didn't kill him, the strain of the hearing might. And if by some miracle he survived both, there was still the progressive disease steadily claiming his strength. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice gruff, "for all of it." Ellie swallowed against the unexpected tightness in her throat. "Just come back," she said softly. "That's all the thanks I need." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned and mounted his horse, his back straight, despite the effort it clearly cost him. Ellie watched until the dust from their departure settled, an inexplicable sense of foreboding settling over her like the coming storm. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later when one of the ranch hands spotted riders on the northern boundary. Josephine ordered the women and children into the main house while the men took up defensive positions around the property. 6, maybe 7 riders, reported Armstrong, who had been posted as lookout, moving slow like they're scouting. "Prescott men?" Ellie asked, helping Josephine distribute ammunition to the ranch hands. "Most likely," the housekeeper replied grimly. "They've been testing our defenses ever since the boss left." The riders didn't approach the ranch buildings, merely circling at a distance before disappearing back over the ridge. But the message was clear. They were watching, waiting for an opportunity. That night, as Ellie made her rounds, checking on the injured men in the infirmary, a soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Josephine, her usually composed face etched with worry. "There's a man at the back door," the housekeeper whispered. "Says he has news of the boss, but he won't speak to anyone but you." Ellie followed Josephine through the darkened house, her heart pounding. The man waiting in the shadows of the back porch was barely more than a boy, thin and nervous, his hat clutched in his hands. "You the healer?" he asked as Ellie approached. "I am. Who are you?" "Name's Billy. I work at the livery in town." He glanced around anxiously before continuing. "I heard something I thought you should know about Mr. Blackwood." Ellie's mouth went dry. "Go on." "2 of Prescott's men came in last night, drunk and talking loose. Said their boss had taken care of Blackwood and that the ranch would be theirs by month's end." The boy shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't like the sound of it, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood's always been fair to me." "When was this?" Ellie's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Last night. They said it happened at Cottonwood Crossing the day before." Cottonwood Crossing was a day's ride from the ranch, on the road to the territorial capital, if what the boy said was true. "Thank you, Billy," she said, pressing a coin into his hand. "You've done the right thing." After the boy left, Ellie and Josephine retreated to the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. "It could be empty boasting," the housekeeper suggested, though her face betrayed her fear. "Men talk big when they're in their cups." "Or it could be true," Ellie countered. "Victor and the others should have reached the capital by now. If they were ambushed at Cottonwood Crossing, the thought was too terrible to complete. If Victor was dead, the ranch would be vulnerable. Without his testimony at the water rights hearing, the Prescotts would likely win their claim, and everyone at Blackwood Ranch would be at their mercy. "What do we do?" Josephine asked, her usual brisk confidence faltering. Ellie took a deep breath, forcing herself to think past the fear and grief threatening to overwhelm her. "First, we send someone to verify the story, one of the younger hands who won't be recognized. Then we prepare." "Prepare for what?" "For whatever comes next," Ellie replied, a new determination hardening her voice. "If Victor is alive, he'll need our help. If he's not..." She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. The next day dawned gray and threatening, the storm that had been building for days finally breaking. Rain lashed the windows of the main house as Ellie paced the library, waiting for news. She had sent young Jenkins, one of the newer hands, to Cottonwood Crossing at first light with instructions to return as quickly as possible. By midday, the rain had become a deluge. Streams overflowed their banks, and the usually dusty yard of the ranch became a sea of mud. Ellie found herself watching the road obsessively, straining to see through the curtain of rain for any sign of a rider. It was near dusk when Jenkins finally returned, soaked to the skin and spattered with mud. His face, when he entered the library, told Ellie everything she needed to know. "There was a shootout," he reported, accepting the whiskey Josephine pressed into his hands. 2 days ago, the station master at Cottonwood said 3 men were killed, 2 more wounded. He didn't know names, but he described Samuel Reed among the dead. Ellie's knees threatened to buckle. Samuel, steady, reliable Samuel, who had worked for the Blackwood since he was a boy. "And Victor?" she managed to ask. "Mr. Blackwood?" Jenkins shook his head. "No sign of him among the dead or wounded. The station master said 1 man was taken prisoner by the attackers. Tall, well-dressed." "Alive, then," Ellie breathed, relief warring with new fear. "The Prescotts have him." What would they want with a prisoner? Josephine wondered. If their goal was to prevent him reaching the hearing, killing him would be simpler. Ellie's mind raced, piecing together what she knew of the Prescotts and their tactics. "Leverage," she said finally. "They need to break Victor's will, make him sign over his land and water rights willingly. A dead man can't sign anything, and the ranch would pass to his cousin back east, who might be more difficult to intimidate. So they'll torture him," Josephine said bluntly, "until he gives them what they want." The thought made Ellie's blood run cold. Victor was already weakened by illness. He wouldn't survive long under such conditions, even if the Prescotts didn't. Kill him outright once they had what they wanted. "How many men do we have who can ride?" she asked, a plan already forming in her mind. 15, maybe 20, Josephine replied. "But they're ranch hands, not gunfighters. And the Prescott Ranch is like a fortress." "We don't need to attack the ranch," Ellie said. "Not yet. First, we need information, where they're holding him, how many men are guarding him, and for that, we need someone on the inside." Josephine stared at her. "You can't be suggesting—" "Yes," Ellie cut her off. "I am. Richard Prescott offered me a position, remember? I think it's time I accepted." The argument that followed was heated but brief. There was no real alternative, and both women knew it. By the time night fell, Ellie had packed a small bag with her most essential medicines and changed into her one good dress, a modest blue calico that she had bought in town with her first wages from Blackwood Ranch. "Remember," Josephine said, as they stood at the back door, the rain still falling steadily outside. 3 days. If you haven't returned or sent word by then, we'll come for you. All of us." Ellie nodded, touched by the fierceness in the older woman's voice. 3 days. "And Josephine, if I don't come back, make sure Victor knows." She hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the complicated tangle of emotions she felt toward the man who had given her a home and purpose when she had nothing. "Make sure he knows I tried." Josephine's weathered face softened. "He knows, child, more than you realize." The Prescott Ranch stood like a medieval castle on a rise overlooking the valley, its main house an ostentatious display of wealth in a land where most people lived in simple adobe or wood frame structures. Lights blazed from every window as Ellie approached, her horse picking its way carefully up the muddy track. A guard stopped her at the gate, his rifle raised suspiciously. "State your business." "My name is Eleanor Campbell," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "I'm here to see Richard Prescott. He offered me a position." The guard eyed her dubiously, but eventually nodded toward the house. "Wait here." Long minutes passed before the guard returned, accompanied by a tall figure with an unmistakable swagger. Richard Prescott's smile was predatory as he approached, holding a lantern high to illuminate her face. "Miss Campbell," he drawled. "What an unexpected pleasure. And in such weather." "Circumstances change," she replied coolly. "I've reconsidered your offer." His eyebrows rose. "Have you now? And what circumstances might have prompted this change of heart?" "I believe you know exactly what circumstances, Mr. Prescott." Ellie met his gaze directly. "Blackwood Ranch is no longer a safe place for me." Richard studied her face for a long moment, then laughed softly. Well, well, the loyal healer abandons the sinking ship. I must say I'm surprised. I took you for the devoted type. "I'm a practical woman, Mr. Prescott. I go where I can be of use, and where I'll be valued." He gestured toward the house with a flourish. "Then by all means, come in out of the rain. We have much to discuss." The interior of the Prescott house was as ostentatious as its exterior. Crystal chandeliers, imported furniture, oil paintings in gilded frames. It spoke of wealth acquired quickly and displayed without taste, a sharp contrast to the understated elegance of Blackwood Ranch. Richard led her to a study where a fire blazed despite the summer heat. Another man sat behind a massive desk, older, but with the same sharp features as Richard. This, Ellie realized, must be Howard Prescott, the elder brother and true power behind the Prescott Empire. "Who's this?" he demanded without preamble. "Eleanor Campbell," Richard replied, "Blackwood's healer. She's come to offer her services to us instead." Howard's cold eyes assessed her. "Has she now? And why would we need another healer?" "Because yours couldn't save your foreman after the snakebite last spring," Ellie said boldly. "And because I know remedies your current man has never heard of." The elder Prescott's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're well informed, Miss Campbell." "I listen," she shrugged, "and people talk to healers." "Indeed." Howard leaned back in his chair. "And what did they say about us, I wonder?" Ellie chose her words carefully. "That you're ambitious men who know what you want and how to get it. That you reward loyalty and punish betrayal. That you're the future of this territory." Richard laughed. "She learns quickly, brother. I like her." Howard remained impassive. "And Blackwood? What do you know of his current situation?" Here was the dangerous ground. Ellie kept her expression neutral. "Only that he left for the territorial capital several days ago and hasn't returned. There are rumors, of course, rumors that he met with trouble on the road." "Trouble of his own making," Howard said dismissively. "The man has enemies." "Many, I'm sure," Ellie agreed smoothly. "That's why I'm here. I prefer to align myself with those who are ascendant rather than in decline." The brothers exchanged a glance that Ellie couldn't interpret. Finally, Howard nodded. "You'll start tomorrow. Richard will show you to your quarters. But understand this, Miss Campbell, betrayal is not tolerated here. If we discover your loyalties still lie with Blackwood..." The threat remained unspoken but clear. "My loyalty is to my craft," Ellie replied, "and to those who value it." As Richard led her through the sprawling house to a small room at the back, Ellie fought to maintain her composure. She was inside the Prescott stronghold, but still no closer to discovering Victor's whereabouts or condition. And the clock was ticking, both for Victor and for the reinforcements waiting at Blackwood Ranch. "I'm sure you'll find everything satisfactory," Richard said as he showed her the sparse room that would be hers. "Our last healer lived in town, but given your special knowledge, we thought it best to keep you close." The implication was clear. They didn't trust her, and they wanted to keep her under observation. "I'll need my supplies brought in," she said, gesturing to her saddlebags. "And I'd like to see your infirmary in the morning." "Of course." Richard lingered in the doorway, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know, Miss Campbell, I think we'll get along." "Very well. I'm sure we will," Ellie replied, forcing a smile. "Provided we understand each other." His smile widened. "Oh, I understand you perfectly." After he left, Ellie sat on the narrow bed, her mind racing. She had gained entry to the Prescott Ranch, but how would she find Victor? The property was vast, with numerous outbuildings and bunkhouses. He could be held anywhere, assuming he was still alive. Sleep eluded her that night as she listened to the sounds of the unfamiliar house settling around her. Somewhere in this maze of a building, or perhaps in one of the outbuildings beyond, Victor Blackwood might be fighting for his life, unaware that help was so near. Dawn brought a break in the rain and a summons from Howard Prescott. As Ellie made her way to his study, she noted the layout of the house, the number of men she passed, the locations of doors and windows. Every detail might prove crucial in the days to come. Howard was alone when she entered, studying a large map spread across his desk. He barely looked up as she approached. "Miss Campbell, I trust you slept well." "Well enough," she replied, "though I'm eager to see your infirmary and assess what supplies I'll need. All in good time." He finally raised his eyes to hers. "First, I want to be certain of your commitment to your new position. Loyalty is everything in this household." "As I said last night, my loyalty is to my craft," Ellie said carefully, "but I understand the need for discretion." "Good." Howard indicated a chair across from him. "Then perhaps you can explain something that's been troubling me. Why would Blackwood's trusted healer suddenly abandon him, especially given his fragile health?" Ellie's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Blackwood left for the territorial capital without taking me along. He clearly doesn't value my services as much as I thought. Or perhaps he values them too much to risk you on a dangerous journey," Howard countered. "From what I've heard, he's grown quite attached to you." The implication made Ellie flush, despite herself. "Mr. Blackwood was my employer, nothing more." Howard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, Miss Campbell. We both know that's not entirely true. A man in Blackwood's position, isolated on that ranch with a beautiful young woman tending to his every need, it would be only natural for attachments to form." Ellie stiffened. "Is there a purpose to these insinuations, Mr. Prescott?" "Merely trying to understand your motivations," he replied smoothly, "and to determine how useful you might be to us." "Useful in what way?" Howard studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "We have a guest who is unwell, someone with a condition similar to Blackwood's. I'm told you've become quite adept at managing his symptoms." Ellie's pulse quickened. "Could it be? I'd be happy to examine your guest," she said, struggling to keep her voice level. "Though I'll need to know the history of the illness." "I think you're already familiar with it," Howard replied with a thin smile. "Richard will take you to him after breakfast, but remember, Miss Campbell, this guest is very important to us. His continued health is a priority, at least until certain papers are signed." The confirmation that Victor was alive and being held somewhere on the property sent a wave of relief through Ellie, so powerful she nearly swayed in her seat. "I understand," she managed to say. "I'll do everything in my power to ensure he remains stable." "See that you do." Howard returned his attention to the map. "That will be all for now." As Ellie left the study, her mind raced with possibilities. She would see Victor soon, assess his condition, and perhaps find a way to communicate her plan. But the Prescotts were watching her closely, suspicious of her sudden appearance. One wrong move could be fatal for them both. The waiting was excruciating. Breakfast was served in a formal dining room where Ellie sat alone, picking at food she had no appetite for while servants moved silently around her. Richard had promised to take her to Victor after breakfast, but the meal seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, as she was considering simply leaving the table, Richard appeared in the doorway. "Ready for your first patient, Miss Campbell?" he asked with that same unsettling smile. Ellie followed Richard through a maze of corridors, memorizing each turn. The Prescott house was even larger than it appeared from outside, with wings extending in multiple directions and staircases that seemed designed to confuse visitors. Finally, they descended a narrow flight of steps to what appeared to be a cellar, the air growing noticeably cooler and damper. "Not exactly the accommodations he's accustomed to," Richard remarked as he unlocked a heavy wooden door. "But we couldn't risk him being seen or heard." The room beyond was small and windowless, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the stone walls. In the corner on a narrow cot lay a figure that Ellie almost didn't recognize. Victor Blackwood, once so imposing, had been reduced to a shadow of himself. His face was gaunt, with several days' growth of beard, and a deep bruise discolored one cheek. His wrists were bound to the frame of the cot with leather straps. Ellie fought to keep her expression neutral despite the surge of rage and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady. "He resisted," Richard replied with a shrug. "Had to be persuaded to cooperate." Ellie approached the cot, her healer's instincts taking over. Victor's breathing was shallow and irregular, his skin hot with fever. Without thinking, she reached out to check his pulse, only to have her wrist caught in Richard's grip. "Remember why you're here, Miss Campbell," he warned. "Keep him alive, that's all. We need him coherent enough to sign some papers tomorrow." "And then?" Ellie asked, unable to stop herself. Richard's smile was cold. "Then his usefulness will have ended." When he released her wrist, Ellie returned her attention to Victor. "I'll need hot water, clean cloths, and my medical bag," she said briskly. "And these restraints must be loosened. They're restricting circulation and could cause gangrene." "Nice try," Richard said with a laugh. "The restraints stay." "Then don't be surprised when you have a corpse by morning," she snapped. "Look at his hands. They're already blue from lack of blood flow." "Dead men can't sign papers, Mr. Prescott." Richard hesitated, then grudgingly moved to loosen the straps. "He stays secured, but I'll grant you that much. And my supplies? I'll have them brought down." He gave her a measuring look. "You have 1 hour with him, make it count." The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving Ellie alone with Victor. For a moment, she simply stood there, struggling against the tide of emotions, threatening to break her composure. Then Victor's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening in recognition. "Ellie?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. Why are you here?" She knelt beside the cot, speaking in a hushed whisper. "We heard about the ambush. I came to find you." Understanding dawned slowly on his face. "You shouldn't have. It's too dangerous." "Says the man chained to a bed," she retorted, the worry making her sharp. "What were you thinking, traveling? That road, it was an obvious trap." "We had no choice." A coughing fit interrupted him, and Ellie supported his head until it passed. "The hearing. Without my testimony, the water rights will go to the Prescotts." "To hell with the water rights," Ellie hissed. "You nearly died." A ghost of his old smile touched his lips. "Your bedside manner needs work." Despite everything, Ellie found herself smiling back. "Save your strength. I'm going to get you out of here." His expression sobered. "How? There are guards everywhere, and I can barely stand." "I have a plan," she assured him, though in truth she was still forming one. "Josephine and the others know I'm here. If we don't return to Blackwood Ranch in 3 days, they'll come for us." Victor shook his head weakly. Too few men. The Prescotts would slaughter them. Before Ellie could respond, footsteps approached outside the door. She quickly moved away from the cot, adopting a clinical demeanor as a servant entered with her medical bag and a basin of steaming water. "Thank you," she said, taking the items. "Please inform Mr. Prescott that I'll need more time than he's allotted. My patient is in worse condition than expected." The servant, a young girl with frightened eyes, nodded and scurried away without speaking. Ellie waited until the footsteps receded before turning back to Victor. "Now, she said, opening her bag and removing several vials. "Let's see what we can do about your condition." Over the next hour, Ellie worked methodically, cleaning Victor's wounds and administering the medicines she had brought. The bruise on his face was the least of his injuries. His ribs were badly bruised, possibly cracked, and there was a deep gash on his leg that showed signs of infection. Worse, his underlying illness had advanced rapidly under the stress and mistreatment, leaving him feverish and weak. "How bad is it?" he asked as she finished bandaging his leg. Ellie hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Bad enough. The fever is my main concern, and the infection in that leg, but nothing that can't be managed with proper care, which I'm unlikely to receive here," he observed dryly. "That's why we're leaving," she replied, lowering her voice again. "Tonight, if possible." Victor's eyes sharpened. "You have a plan?" "The beginnings of one." Ellie glanced toward the door. "The Prescotts think I've betrayed you to save myself. They believe I'm here to keep you alive just long enough to sign over your land and water rights. And instead, I'm going to get you well enough to walk out of here." She began repacking her medical bag, her mind racing. "They want you to sign papers tomorrow. That gives us until then to find a way out." The heavy door opened again, and Richard Prescott strolled in, looking irritatingly confident. "Time's up, Miss Campbell. How's our patient?" "Stable for now," Ellie replied, straightening, "but I'll need to check on him again this evening. The fever is concerning." Richard studied Victor with cold satisfaction. "He just needs to last until tomorrow's meeting with our lawyer. After that," he shrugged eloquently. "I understand," Ellie said, matching his callous tone. "But if you want him coherent enough to sign, I'll need regular access to monitor his condition." "Very well." Richard gestured for her to precede him out of the room. "You can return after dinner, under supervision, of course." "Of course," Ellie agreed, casting one last glance at Victor before leaving. His eyes met hers briefly, and she tried to convey reassurance she didn't entirely feel. The rest of the day passed in an agony of waiting. Ellie was shown the Prescott Infirmary, a well-stocked but seldom used room where she pretended to inventory supplies while actually pocketing small items that might prove useful: a scalpel, some laudanum, bandages that could serve as bindings or makeshift rope. She met the few other women at the ranch, mostly servants who kept their eyes downcast and spoke little, clearly fearful of their employers. Dinner was a strained affair with both Prescott brothers at a table large enough for 20. Howard dominated the conversation, expounding on his plans for expanding the Prescott holdings once the water rights were secured. "With Blackwood's land and water, we'll control the entire Northern Valley," he boasted, carving into a thick steak. "The railroad investors I've been courting will have no choice but to deal with us." "Ambitious," Ellie commented, pushing food around her plate. "Though I imagine Mr. Blackwood's men might object." Howard's laugh was dismissive. "Those saddle tramps, once their meal ticket is gone, they'll either work for us or move on. Men like that follow the money." "And if they don't?" Ellie couldn't resist asking. Howard's eyes hardened. "Then they'll learn what happens to those who stand in our way." The threat hung in the air, a reminder of what awaited not just Victor, but everyone at Blackwood Ranch if the Prescott brothers succeeded in their plan. After dinner, as promised, Richard escorted Ellie back to Victor's cell, this time accompanied by a guard who took up position just inside the door. "Don't try anything clever," Richard warned her. "Jenkins here has orders to shoot if necessary." Ellie nodded, keeping her expression neutral as she approached Victor's cot. He was awake, his eyes clearer than before, though the fever still burned in his cheeks. "How are you feeling?" she asked, loud enough for the guard to hear. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," Victor replied, with a weak attempt at humor. Ellie began her examination, speaking in a normal tone about his symptoms and treatment, while her hands conveyed a different message. As she checked the bandage on his leg, she pressed a small object into his palm. The scalpel she had taken from the infirmary, now wrapped in a scrap of cloth to protect the blade. Victor's fingers closed around it immediately, his eyes flickering with understanding. He slipped it beneath the thin mattress of the cot in a movement so fluid it was nearly imperceptible. "The fever is still concerning," Ellie announced for the benefit of their audience. "I'll mix a stronger tincture and return in the morning." "Will he be well enough to meet with the lawyer?" Richard asked impatiently. Ellie gave him a level look. "That depends on whether he receives proper care tonight. He needs water regularly, and someone should check his fever. Jenkins can manage." "That," Richard said dismissively. "As you wish." Ellie packed her bag, her mind working furiously. She needed a way to communicate her escape plan to Victor without arousing suspicion. "I've prepared a list of instructions for his care," she added, withdrawing a folded paper from her pocket. "Perhaps I should leave it with him, in case your man has questions." Richard frowned but nodded. "Fine, but I'll read it first." He took the paper, scanning it quickly before handing it back with a snort. "Medical gibberish. Go ahead." Ellie placed the paper on the small table beside Victor's cot, positioning it so he could read it without straining. Between the legitimate medical instructions, she had embedded a coded message that she hoped he would understand. References to midnight doses and Western exposure treatment that indicated her plan to return at midnight and escape through the west-facing window that she had spotted in a storage room adjacent to the cellar. "Rest as much as you can," she told Victor as she prepared to leave. "Tomorrow will be eventful." His eyes met hers, a flicker of his old determination visible. Despite his weakened state, "I'm counting on it." Back in her assigned room, Ellie made a show of preparing medicines, grinding herbs and mixing tinctures while her mind raced through the details of escape. The Prescott Ranch was heavily guarded, with men patrolling the grounds even at night. They would need a distraction, something significant enough to draw attention away from the cellar where Victor was held. As darkness fell, Ellie moved to the window of her room, studying the layout of the ranch buildings below. The main house, where she now was connected to a series of outbuildings, a cookhouse, stables, and what appeared to be a storage barn. Beyond those lay the bunkhouses where the ranch hands slept. Far to the west, barely visible in the gathering dusk, stood another structure, larger and more imposing. "The new barn," a voice said behind her, causing Ellie to start. She turned to find Josephine standing in the doorway, a bundle of linens in her arms. "I didn't hear you come in," Ellie said, her heart pounding. Had the housekeeper been sent to spy on her? "Fresh sheets for your bed," Josephine explained, setting the bundle down. "Howard Prescott likes his staff well accommodated, even if they're rarely treated with dignity otherwise." There was something in the woman's tone that gave Ellie pause. "How long have you worked for the Prescotts?" 6 years, Josephine replied, moving to make the bed with practiced efficiency. "Since my husband died and I had nowhere else to go." Ellie watched her work, noting the careful way the woman avoided meeting her eyes. "It must be difficult." "It's a living." Josephine's voice was carefully neutral, better than begging on the streets of Copper Creek. On an impulse, Ellie decided to take a risk. "That new barn, what is it used for?" Josephine's hands stilled momentarily. "Grain storage mostly, and hay for the winter." She finished making the bed and straightened, finally meeting Ellie's gaze directly. "It would be a terrible shame if anything happened to it, or that dry straw. Why, a single spark could set the whole thing ablaze." The implication was clear, and Ellie felt a surge of hope. Perhaps there were allies to be found even here in the heart of enemy territory. "Indeed," she agreed carefully, "such a fire would certainly draw attention. perhaps even from those who might otherwise be watching other things. Josephine nodded almost imperceptibly. It would be a distraction, to be sure. She gathered the old linens and moved toward the door. "Sleep well, Miss Campbell. I imagine tomorrow will be an eventful day." The echo of Ellie's own words to Victor was not lost on her. As the door closed behind Josephine, Ellie felt a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps they weren't as alone as she had feared. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Ellie prepared what few possessions she had brought, concealing the smaller vials of medicine in her pockets and wrapping food stolen from the dinner table in a napkin. At 11:30, she extinguished her lamp and sat in darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night. Precisely at midnight, she slipped from her room and into the darkened hallway. The main house was quiet, most of its occupants long since retired. She made her way down the corridor, pausing at each intersection to listen for guards or servants. The route to the cellar was more complicated in darkness, but Ellie had memorized the turns and staircases during her earlier visits. She arrived at the heavy door that led to the lower level and hesitated, listening for any sound of the guard Richard had posted. Hearing nothing, she cautiously tested the handle. To her surprise, it turned easily in her grasp. The staircase beyond was dark, but a faint light glowed from below, presumably the oil lamp in Victor's cell. Ellie descended carefully, each step measured to avoid creaking. At the bottom, she peered around the corner and froze. The guard, Jenkins, was slumped in a chair outside Victor's door, his chin on his chest as if sleeping. But the unnatural angle of his head and the dark stain on his shirt front told a different story. He had been killed, his throat cut with a blade very much like the scalpel Ellie had smuggled to Victor. Her first thought was that Victor had somehow managed to escape on his own, but then she noticed that the cell door remained closed. Approaching cautiously, she eased it open to find Victor still on the cot, the restraints now cut and discarded, attempting to pull himself to a sitting position. "What happened?" she whispered, hurrying to his side. "The guard?" "Wasn't me," Victor replied grimly. "Someone came about an hour ago. I heard a struggle, then nothing." Ellie helped him sit up, noting with concern how much effort it cost him. "Can you walk?" "If the alternative is staying here to be executed, I'll manage," he said, his jaw set with determination. Supporting much of his weight, Ellie helped Victor to his feet. He swayed alarmingly, but remained upright, his breathing labored. Together, they made their way slowly toward the door. "Wait," Victor said suddenly. "Check the guard for weapons." Ellie hesitated, reluctant to approach the dead man, but saw the wisdom in Victor's request. Steeling herself, she quickly searched Jenkins' body, finding a revolver in his holster and a hunting knife at his belt. She took both, handing the revolver to Victor and keeping the knife for herself. "There's a storage room with a window at the end of this corridor," she whispered, as they moved painfully slowly past the guard's body. "It should lead to the yard behind the cookhouse. From there we can make for the tree line to the west." Victor nodded, saving his breath for the effort of walking. Even with Ellie's support, each step was clearly agonizing. The infection in his leg and the fever from his illness were taking their toll. They had just reached the storage room when a distant boom shattered the night's silence, followed by shouts of alarm. Through the small ground-level window, an orange glow suddenly illuminated the yard. "The barn," Ellie breathed. "Someone set it on fire." "Our distraction?" Victor asked, leaning heavily against the wall. "It seems we have an ally," she replied, moving to work the rusted latch on the window. It resisted at first, then gave way with a screech that made both of them wince. The window was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and positioned several feet off the ground. For someone in Victor's condition, it presented a daunting obstacle. "You go first," he insisted, gesturing toward the opening. "I'll follow." Ellie shook her head firmly. "You first. I'll help boost you up and if necessary, push from behind while you pull yourself through." Victor started to argue but stopped at the look on her face. With a nod, he accepted her help in positioning himself at the window. The process was slow and painful, with Victor stifling groans as the movement aggravated his injuries. Twice he nearly fell back, his strength failing, but finally managed to drag himself through the opening and drop to the ground outside with a muffled thud. Ellie followed more easily, landing beside him in what turned out to be a narrow space between the main house and a storage shed. The fire at the barn had grown, flames now leaping high into the night sky. Men were running toward it from all directions, shouting instructions and forming a bucket line from the nearest well. "Perfect timing," Ellie murmured, helping Victor to his feet once more. "Everyone's focused on the fire." "Not everyone," a cold voice said behind them. Ellie whirled to find Richard Prescott standing at the end of the narrow passage, a shotgun leveled at their chests. His face was twisted with rage in the flickering light from the distant fire. "I knew you couldn't be trusted," he spat at Ellie. "No one betrays Victor Blackwood except for money or love, and I didn't offer you enough of either." Victor struggled to raise the revolver he had taken from the guard, but Richard noticed the movement and barked a laugh. "Don't bother, Blackwood. In your condition, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, even one that's currently on fire." His expression hardened. "Though I do have to thank you for taking care of Jenkins. Saved me the trouble of disposing of him later. The man knew too much about our business with the territorial judge." "You bribed Judge Hollister," Victor said, his voice ragged but clear. "That's why you were so confident about the water rights hearing." Richard's smile was cold. "Money talks, Blackwood. Always has, always will. Your high-minded principles were never going to prevail against cold, hard cash. And yet you still felt the need to ambush me on the road," Victor observed. "If your bribe was so certain, why prevent me from attending the hearing?" "Insurance," Richard replied with a shrug. "Why take chances? Besides, my brother wanted the satisfaction of having you sign over your land personally, a final humiliation before putting you in the ground." While they talked, Ellie's hand had closed around the handle of the hunting knife concealed in the folds of her skirt. If she could create a moment of distraction... As if in answer to her unspoken prayer, another explosion rocked the night, closer. This time, from the direction of the stables. Richard instinctively glanced toward the sound, and in that split second, Ellie acted. She flung the knife with all her strength, not aiming to kill, but to distract. The blade caught Richard in the shoulder, spinning him around with the force of the impact. His shotgun discharged harmlessly into the air as he staggered backward, howling in pain and rage. "Run!" Ellie shouted, once again supporting Victor. As they stumbled away from Richard and toward the cover of darkness beyond the ranch buildings. Behind them, Richard's shouts had drawn attention. Lanterns bobbed in the yard as men turned from the fire to investigate the new commotion. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from Ellie's head as they rounded the corner of the cookhouse. The tree line was still 100 yards away across open ground, an impossible distance for Victor in his current state. Already he was faltering, his breath coming in ragged gasps as fever and exhaustion took their toll. "Leave me," he urged between gasps. "I'm slowing you down. Save yourself." "Not a chance," Ellie replied grimly, tightening her grip around his waist. "We either escape together or not at all." More shots rang out behind them, closer now. Ellie could hear men shouting, moving to cut off their escape. Then from the darkness ahead came an answering volley of gunfire. Shapes emerged from the trees, mounted figures driving hard toward them. "Blackwood men!" Victor exclaimed, new hope giving him strength. Leading the charge was Josephine astride. a sorrel mare and wielding a rifle with practiced ease. Behind her rode a dozen ranch hands from Blackwood, firing as they came to provide covering fire for their escaping employer. They reached Ellie and Victor just as Richard and his men closed in from behind. In a chaotic moment of shouts and gunfire, Ellie found herself being lifted onto a horse. Victor pulled up behind her by strong hands. Then they were galloping away, bullets whining past their ears as the Prescott men gave chase. "Hold on!" Josephine shouted over the thunder of hooves. "It's a long ride back to Blackwood." Victor's arms circled Ellie's waist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his condition. She could feel the heat of his fever through his shirt, the labored rise and fall of his chest against her back. But he was alive, and they were free, for the moment at least. The Prescott men pursued them for miles, only breaking off when the fugitives reached a narrow pass where Josephine had wisely positioned more Blackwood men with rifles. Safe passage secured, they slowed their pace to accommodate Victor's deteriorating condition. "How did you know?" Ellie asked Josephine when they paused to rest the horses at a stream. "That we would try to escape tonight." The older woman's stern face relaxed into something approaching a smile. "I didn't. But 3 days seemed too long." "Wait! What with your man looking half dead already?" She glanced toward Victor, who had been laid carefully on a blanket nearby. "Besides, I recognized you the moment you arrived at Prescott Ranch." "Recognized me?" Ellie repeated, confused. Josephine nodded. "You don't remember me, but I was there the day they pulled your family from the flood. I helped bury your mother." Her voice softened. "I knew then you were a survivor. When you showed up at Prescott's door, I figured you had a plan worth supporting." "The fire at the barn," Ellie guessed. "And the stables," Josephine confirmed with grim satisfaction. "I've been waiting years for a chance to strike back at those men. They ruined my husband just like they tried to ruin your Mr. Blackwood." "He's not my Mr. Blackwood," Ellie protested automatically. Josephine's knowing look made her flush. "Keep telling yourself that, girl, but I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him when you think no one's watching." Before Ellie could formulate a response, a shout went up from one of the men keeping watch. "Riders coming, a lot of them." "Prescott's?" Josephine demanded, reaching for her rifle. The lookout shook his head. "Don't think so. They're coming from the east, from Blackwood Ranch." The riders appeared from the east like ghosts materializing out of the pre-dawn mist. A column of men 20 strong with rifles glinting dully in the faint light. At their head rode a tall figure that Ellie recognized instantly. Armstrong, the senior ranch hand who had stayed behind to guard Blackwood Ranch. "Miss Campbell," he called as they approached, relief evident in his voice. Josephine sent word that you'd found the boss. His gaze shifted to Victor, who lay pale and still on the makeshift bedroll. Armstrong's weathered face tightened with concern. "How bad is he?" "Bad enough," Ellie replied, already gathering her medical supplies. "The fever's worsening, and he's lost blood. We need to get him home." Armstrong dismounted in a swift, fluid motion. "We brought a wagon, padded it with blankets best we could." He gestured toward the rear of the column, where a covered wagon waited. "The Prescotts?" "Right behind us," Josephine cut in, her rifle still at the ready. "They'll have gathered reinforcements by now. We need to move." With careful efficiency, the men transferred Victor to the wagon. Ellie climbed in beside him, positioning herself to brace his head against the inevitable jolts of the journey. As the wagon lurched into motion, she checked his pulse again. Weak but steady, a fighter's pulse. "Stay with me," she murmured, more prayer than command. "We're almost home." The journey back to Blackwood Ranch was a blur of dust and anxiety. Victor drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to answer Ellie's questions, sometimes lost in fever dreams that had him calling out names she didn't recognize. Once he grabbed her hand with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly clear and intense. "The water rights hearing," he rasped. "It's tomorrow." "Without my testimony, forget the hearing," Ellie insisted, trying to ease him back down. "You're in no condition to travel to the territorial capital." "Must," he insisted. "Everything depends on it. The ranch, our future." He lapsed back into unconsciousness before she could argue further, but his words lingered in her mind. Our future. Not his future or the ranch's future, but our future. As if she were now inextricably linked to Blackwood Ranch and its fate. They reached the ranch just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the buildings in hues of gold and amber. The place had never looked more beautiful to Ellie's weary eyes, nor more fragile, a haven that could be lost if the Prescotts succeeded in their schemes. The ranch hands had transformed the main house in their absence, turning the parlor into a makeshift infirmary, with a bed set up near the large front windows where light and air could reach the patient. As they carried Victor inside, Ellie was struck by the grim determination on the faces of the men. They might be cowhands rather than warriors, as Howard Prescott had dismissively called them, but their loyalty was a force to be reckoned with. "Miss Campbell," Armstrong said as they settled Victor on the bed. "What do you need?" Ellie was already rolling up her sleeves, her mind cataloguing tasks by priority. "Fresh water, clean bandages, and someone to ride to town for medicines I don't have here. And postcards. The Prescotts won't be far behind." Armstrong nodded, turning to issue orders to the men crowding the doorway. As they dispersed, Josephine appeared with a basin of steaming water and a stack of clean linens. "I've sent for the doctor in Silver Springs," she said, setting the items beside the bed. "He's a day's ride, but better than nothing." Ellie nodded. Gratefully, though privately, she doubted Victor had a day to spare. The infection in his leg had worsened during their flight, angry red streaks now extending upward toward his thigh, the harbinger of blood poisoning that could kill within hours if not checked. Working swiftly, she cleaned the wound again, probing, gently to ensure no debris remained lodged in the depths of the gash. Victor stirred at the pain, but didn't wake, which concerned her more than if he had cried out. His body was conserving what little strength remained, shutting down all but the most essential functions. "I need my grandmother's book," she told. "Josephine, the one with the red leather binding, it's in my room." While the housekeeper went to fetch it, Ellie continued her examination. Beyond the infected leg and the obvious bruising, Victor's underlying illness had progressed alarmingly. His lungs rattled with each labored breath, and his skin had a yellow cast that suggested his liver was now affected. Without intervention, he would likely not survive the day, let alone make it to the water rights hearing. Josephine returned with the book, its worn pages filled with handwritten remedies that had been passed down through generations of healers in Ellie's family. She turned to a section near the back, where the most potent and dangerous treatments were recorded. "I need yarrow and willow bark," she said, scanning the spidery script, "and honey, if there's any to be had." "There's a hive in the orchard," one of the younger hands volunteered from the doorway. "I can get some if you don't mind it being wild." "Wild is better," Ellie assured him. "Stronger medicine." As the ranch mobilized to gather what she needed, Ellie sat beside Victor, bathing his face with cool water to combat the fever. In repose, with the lines of pain and responsibility temporarily erased, he looked younger, still the idealistic young man who had taken over his father's ranch with dreams of building something that would last. "You won't die," she told him fiercely, though he couldn't hear. "I won't allow it." Within the hour, she had what she needed to prepare the potent mixture from her grandmother's book, a remedy used only in the direst circumstances when conventional. Medicine offered no hope. The risks were significant. The dose that could save him might also kill him if his weakened body couldn't withstand its effects. Josephine watched as Ellie measured the ingredients with painstaking precision. "Will it work?" she asked quietly. "It has to," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Nothing else will, not in time." The mixture, when completed, was an unappetizing brownish-green paste with a pungent odor that filled the room. Ellie carefully spread it on the infected leg wound, then prepared a tea from the same herbs for Victor to drink. "Help me lift his head," she instructed Josephine. "He needs to swallow as much of this as possible." Together, they managed to get most of the liquid down Victor's throat, though he coughed and sputtered at the bitter taste. Ellie sat back, her task complete for the moment. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if the treatment would save him or hasten his end. "You should rest," Josephine urged, noticing Ellie's exhaustion. "I'll sit with him." Ellie shook her head. "I need to monitor his reaction to the medicine." She didn't add that she couldn't bear to leave him, not when each breath might be his last. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Outside, the ranch hands had established a defensive perimeter, expecting the Prescotts to appear at any moment. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and Victor's labored breathing. Near midday, the crisis came. Victor's fever spiked dramatically, his body rigid with convulsions as the medicine worked its way through his system. Ellie held him down as gently as she could, murmuring reassurances, though she knew he couldn't hear. This was the moment of truth. His body would either overcome the infection with the help of the potent herbs, or the strain would prove too much for his weakened heart. Just when it seemed he couldn't endure anymore, the convulsions stopped. Victor lay still, so still that for one terrible moment Ellie thought he had died. Then she saw the faint rise and fall of his chest, slower now, but steadier. She pressed trembling fingers to his wrist and found his pulse, stronger than before, with a more regular rhythm. "The fever's breaking," she announced to Josephine, who had remained a silent sentinel throughout the ordeal. "I think he's turned the corner." The housekeeper's stern face softened with relief. "Thank God," she breathed, "and thank you, Miss Campbell." Ellie shook her head, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. "Don't thank me yet. He's still very weak, and the underlying illness remains. This is just one battle won, not the war." But it was a significant victory. By evening, Victor was conscious again, his eyes clear for the first time since his capture. He accepted small sips of broth from Ellie's hand, studying her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "You look terrible," he observed, his voice a raspy whisper but tinged with his old dry humor. "You're one to talk," she retorted, though in truth she knew she must look a fright, hair tangled, clothes stained with blood and medicine, dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep. His hand found hers, surprisingly warm now that the fever had receded. "You saved my life." Again. "Just evening the score," she replied lightly. "You gave me a home when I had none, remember? Is that all it was?" His gaze held hers, searching for something she wasn't ready to name. Before she could respond, Armstrong appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Riders coming," he announced. "A lot of them. Prescotts and what looks like half the territory with them." Victor struggled to sit up, grimacing at the pain the movement caused. "How many?" 30, maybe more," Armstrong replied. "And they've got the territorial marshal with them." Ellie's heart sank. The marshal's presence meant the Prescotts had found a way to give their vendetta the veneer of legal authority. "Help me up," Victor ordered, his jaw set with determination. "You can't possibly," Ellie began, but he cut her off with a look. "I will not meet whatever charges they've concocted lying in bed like an invalid," he said firmly. "Help me, or I'll do it myself." Recognizing the futility of arguing, Ellie and Armstrong supported Victor as he painfully made his way to his feet. Dressed in clean clothes, hastily brought by Josephine, he managed to look somewhat like his old self, though the effort of standing left him pale and sweating. "A chair on the porch," he directed. "I'll receive them there." By the time the Prescott contingent reached the ranch yard, Victor was seated on the wide front porch, like a king holding court, flanked by Ellie and Armstrong. Behind them, every able-bodied man and woman on Blackwood Ranch stood armed and ready, a silent statement of solidarity. Howard Prescott led the procession, his face a mask of righteous indignation. Beside him rode Richard, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his expression murderous. And with them, as Armstrong had reported, was the territorial marshal, a Weasley man named Garrett, who was known to be easily influenced by those with money and power. "Victor Blackwood," the marshal called as they halted before the porch. "You're under arrest for the murder of Jenkins Davies and the assault on Richard Prescott, as well as arson and destruction of property at the Prescott Ranch." A murmur of anger ran through the Blackwood men, but Victor raised a hand to silence them. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the yard despite its weakness. "Interesting charges, Marshal, especially considering I was being held prisoner at the Prescott Ranch at the time, after being ambushed on the public road to the territorial capital." The Marshal shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "That's not what the witnesses say. I'm sure the witnesses the Prescotts have provided are very convincing," Victor replied dryly. "But perhaps you'd be interested in hearing from some other witnesses, like the stage driver who saw my men gunned down at Cottonwood Crossing, or the lawyer in the territorial capital who's still waiting for my testimony on certain water rights that the Prescotts have been illegally claiming." Howard Prescott's face darkened with anger. "You're in no position to make accusations, Blackwood, not when we have you dead to rights for murder." "Murder?" Ellie stepped forward, unable to contain herself any longer. "Mr. Blackwood was chained to a bed when Jenkins died. I was there. I saw the body. Someone cut his throat, but it wasn't Victor Blackwood." The Marshal's gaze shifted to her, taking in her disheveled appearance with obvious skepticism. "And who might you be, miss?" "Eleanor Campbell. I'm the healer at Blackwood Ranch." "And what were you doing at Prescott Ranch?" the Marshal asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "She was trying to save my life," Victor interjected before Ellie could respond. "After your friends, the Prescotts, had me beaten, starved, and left to die of infection." "Richard," Prescott sneered, "a touching story, but it doesn't explain the dead man in our cellar or the destruction of our property." "No," agreed a new voice from the back of the crowd, "but I can explain that." A murmur ran through both groups as a figure pushed forward, a man Ellie had never seen before, dressed in the rough clothes of a ranch hand, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Who the hell are you?" Howard Prescott demanded. The stranger reached into his pocket and withdrew a badge that glinted in the late afternoon sun. "Matthew Hollister, Pinkerton Detective. Agency, I've been working undercover at your ranch for the past 3 months, Mr. Prescott, gathering evidence on your various business practices." The effect of this announcement was electric. Howard Prescott went pale, while Richard's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before thinking better of it. "That's a lie," Howard spluttered. "We don't have any hired hand named Hollister." "You know me as Mike Harper," the detective replied with a thin smile. "Took on mucking out stalls about 12 weeks back. Amazing what people will say in front of a man they consider beneath their notice." The territorial marshal looked deeply uncomfortable now, glancing between the Prescotts and the detective as if trying to determine which way the wind was blowing. "I can confirm that Victor Blackwood was being held illegally at the Prescott Ranch," Hollister continued, "and I can also confirm that he had nothing to do with Jenkins Davies' death." His smile turned grim. "That was my handiwork. Self-defense, after he caught me searching the cellar for evidence." "Evidence of what, exactly?" the marshal asked, sensing that his position might be more precarious than he had initially thought. Hollister reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio. Evidence of bribery of territorial officials, including Judge Rollins, who was set to rule on the water rights hearing tomorrow. Evidence of land fraud, intimidation of neighboring ranchers, and conspiracy to commit murder, specifically the planned execution of Victor Blackwood once he had signed over his property, under duress. A shocked silence fell over the assembly. The marshal, now visibly sweating, eased his horse away from the Prescotts as if their criminality might be contagious. "These are outrageous accusations," Howard Prescott blustered, though his face had gone the color of tallow. "You have no proof." "On the contrary," Hollister replied, patting the portfolio. "I have ledgers detailing payments to various officials, including our good marshal here. I have correspondence between you and your lawyers discussing the unfortunate accident planned for Mr. Blackwood. And I have witness statements from 3 of your former employees who were involved in the ambush at Cottonwood Crossing." The sudden marshal, seeing which way the situation was headed, made a quick calculation. "Howard and Richard Prescott," he announced with all the authority he could muster, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and bribery of territorial officials." Howard Prescott's face contorted with rage. "You miserable coward," he spat. "After all we've paid you, I'd be careful about admitting to bribing a law enforcement officer in front of so many witnesses," the marshal warned, his self-preservation instincts finally kicking in. "Now hand over your weapons and come along, peacefully." For a moment, it seemed the Prescott brothers might resist. Richard's hand still hovered near his gun, and Howard looked ready to order their men to fight. But as they glanced around, they saw that many of their own hands were already backing away, unwilling to die for employers whose crimes had been so publicly exposed. With venomous glares at Victor and Ellie, the Prescotts finally surrendered their weapons and allowed themselves to be taken into custody. As the marshal led them away, the detective Hollister approached the porch. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, offering his hand, "I apologize for not revealing myself sooner. I had to be certain I had gathered enough evidence to ensure the Prescotts wouldn't escape justice." Victor shook the man's hand, though the effort clearly cost him. "No apology necessary. You've saved Blackwood Ranch and quite possibly my life. That honor belongs to Miss Campbell, from what I observed," Hollister replied with a respectful nod to Ellie. "Your arrival at Prescott Ranch forced my hand. I was concerned you might inadvertently expose my investigation. But your plan to rescue Mr. Blackwood provided the perfect opportunity to gather the final evidence I needed." "You killed Jenkins," Ellie said, remembering the guard's slit throat. "That was a risk." Hollister's expression hardened. Jenkins was more than just a guard. He was the Prescott's preferred executioner. "I've documented at least 3 accidents. He arranged for people who got in the brothers' way." He looked back at Victor. "He was assigned to kill you once the transfer documents were signed." Victor nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. What happens now?" "The Prescotts will stand trial in the territorial capital," Hollister replied. "Given the evidence I've collected, they're looking at significant prison time. As for the water rights, with Judge Rollins implicated in the bribery scheme, a new hearing will be scheduled with an impartial judge." "When?" Victor asked, his voice betraying his exhaustion. "Not for several weeks at least," Hollister assured him. "Plenty of time for you to recover." As the detective departed to assist the marshal with the prisoners, Victor finally allowed his carefully maintained facade of strength to crumble. He sagged in his chair, his face gray with pain and fatigue. "Let's get you back to bed," Ellie said gently, signaling for Armstrong to help. "In a moment," Victor replied, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold. "I just want to enjoy this." Ellie followed his gaze, understanding what he meant. The land stretched before them, wild and beautiful, bathed in the dying light of day. Blackwood land, saved from those who would exploit it for profit without regard for its true value. "It's worth it," Victor said softly, as if reading her thoughts. All of it, the pain, the struggle, to preserve this. Yes, Ellie agreed, surprising herself with the depth of feeling in her voice. It is. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement of shared values, shared purpose, perhaps even shared future. The moment was broken by Armstrong clearing his throat. "Boss, you're about to fall out of that chair, and Miss Campbell looks ready to drop where she stands. Begging your pardons, but you both need rest." Victor's lips quirked in a tired smile. "Always the voice of reason, Armstrong." "Very well." With their support, he made his way back to the bed that had been set up in the parlor. As Ellie checked his bandages and prepared a milder version of her grandmother's remedy for the night, she was acutely aware of his gaze following her movements. "You should sleep," she told him as she finished. "You've had enough excitement for one day." "So have you," he countered. "When was the last time you rested?" Ellie couldn't remember. The past days had blurred together in a haze of fear, determination, and desperate action. "I'll sleep now," she promised. "Josephine can watch over you for a while." As she turned to leave, Victor caught her hand. Ellie. It was still strange to hear him use her given name, but pleasant too. "Thank you isn't adequate for what you've done." "No thanks necessary," she replied, echoing his own words from what seemed a lifetime ago. "We're even, remember?" "No," he said, his gaze intent despite his exhaustion. "We're not even close to even, but I intend to spend a very long time trying to get there." The promise in his words made her breath catch. "That sounds like a future," she said softly. "Our future," he corrected, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it. "If you want it." Ellie didn't answer immediately, the magnitude of the choice before her momentarily overwhelming. This man, this land, they had become so much a part of her in such a short time. The flood had taken everything she thought defined her life, only for her to discover a new purpose, a new home, perhaps even a new heart. "Get well first," she said finally. "Then we'll talk about the future." His smile, though weary, held genuine warmth. "I'll hold you to that, Miss Campbell." In the days that followed, Victor's recovery progressed steadily, if slowly. The infection cleared, and with proper rest and nutrition, he began to regain his strength. The underlying illness remained a concern, but Ellie's treatments kept the worst symptoms at bay, allowing him to function almost normally for extended periods. News arrived from the territorial capital that the Prescott brothers had been formally charged with multiple crimes, including attempted murder and corruption. With their influence shattered, many of those they had intimidated over the years came forward with additional accusations, ensuring that the brothers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The water rights hearing was rescheduled for the following month, with a judge brought in from another territory to ensure impartiality. Pinkerton Detective Hollister provided documents proving that the Prescotts had illegally diverted water from Blackwood land, strengthening Victor's case. As the day of the hearing approached, Ellie found herself increasingly anxious, not about the outcome. She had faith that justice would prevail, but about what would come after. Her position at Blackwood Ranch had begun as a matter of necessity for both her and Victor. But now, with Victor recovering and her services less critically needed, what place did she have? She was in the garden, harvesting herbs for her medicines and pondering these questions when Victor found her. He moved more easily now, though he still carried a cane for longer walks. "Josephine said you'd be out here," he said, watching as she carefully cut sprigs of rosemary and thyme. "Preparing for my imminent demise again?" Ellie smiled at his dry humor. "Just replenishing my supplies. Your men are remarkably accident-prone. Torres managed to dislocate the same shoulder twice in 1 week." They do seem to require your attention. With unusual frequency these days, Victor observed, seating himself on a nearby bench, almost as if they're inventing reasons to visit the infirmary. Ellie felt her cheeks warm. The ranch hands had indeed been seeking her out for increasingly minor ailments, splinters, small cuts, even headaches that miraculously resolved as soon as she offered a remedy. She had attributed it to their newfound respect after her role in saving their employer, but Victor's tone suggested another interpretation. "I believe they're attempting to keep you busy," Victor continued, his expression serious now, "because they're worried you might leave if you're not needed." Ellie's hands stilled among the herbs. "And are you worried about that too?" she asked, not meeting his eyes. "Terrified," he admitted with a frankness that surprised her. "Which is why I've been avoiding this conversation, despite promising myself I wouldn't delay once I was well. Enough." Now she did look at him, finding his gaze already fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "The hearing is in 3 days," he said. "After that, the immediate threat to Blackwood Ranch will be over. You'll have fulfilled any obligation you might feel toward me or this place." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "So I'm asking, now, before duty or gratitude can influence your decision, what do you want, Eleanor Campbell? What do you want, Eleanor Campbell?" The question hung in the warm garden air, deceptively simple yet impossibly complex. Ellie set down her basket of herbs, buying herself a moment to organize the thoughts that tumbled through her mind. "I want," she began, then stopped, realizing the enormity of what she was about to say. A year ago, her wants had been clear: a peaceful life with her family on their small farm, security in the familiar. The flood had washed away those simple desires along with everything else, leaving her adrift in a world where wanting anything seemed like tempting fate. "I want to be useful," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "To use the knowledge my grandmother gave me. I want purpose." Victor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Blackwood Ranch needs a healer. There will always be a place for you here in that capacity, if that's what you wish." "Is that all you're offering?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider, surprising them both with its directness. Victor's eyes widened slightly, then a slow smile spread across his face, not the guarded half-smile she was accustomed to, but something genuine and warm that transformed his features. "No," he said simply. "That's not all I'm offering." He rose from the bench, crossing the short distance between them. Taking her hands in his, earth-stained as they were from the garden, he continued, "I'm offering everything, Ellie. This land, this home, whatever I have is yours already in every way that matters. You brought life back to this place when you arrived. You brought life back to me." His voice roughened with emotion. "I'm offering a partnership if you want it, in whatever form you choose." Ellie looked up at him, this man who had first appeared to her as a stern, unapproachable figure on a black stallion, and who now stood before her with his heart in his hands. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, the loss, the struggle, the moments of connection forged in crisis and quiet alike. "I choose all of it," she said, her own voice steady with certainty. "The partnership, the home, the future, whatever it holds." His hands tightened on hers. "It won't be easy," he warned. "My illness can be managed," she interrupted firmly. "I told you before, you could have years, good years, and you're willing to spend them with a man who might leave you alone again." Her smile was gentle but determined. "I've been alone before, I survived, but I'd rather have whatever time we're granted together than safety without you." Something in Victor's expression shifted, a shadow lifting that she hadn't even realized. Was there until it was gone. He drew her closer, one hand releasing hers to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Eleanor Campbell," he said softly, "I believe you may be the strongest person I've ever known. Before she could respond, his lips met hers in a kiss that spoke of promises and possibilities, of a future being written with each breath they shared. When they finally parted, Ellie felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as if the scattered pieces of her life had finally fallen into their proper places. "Does this mean I should stop sending Torres to the infirmary with fabricated injuries?" Victor asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Ellie laughed, the sound bright in the golden afternoon. "Please do. The poor man's shoulder needs a rest." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, the garden fragrant around them with herbs that healed and nourished. Ellie glanced at the man beside her, noting how he leaned less heavily on his cane than he had just days before, how the color had returned to his face, how his steps matched hers as if they had been walking together for years rather than weeks. 3 days later, they rode to the territorial capital together for the water rights hearing. Victor insisted on making the journey despite Ellie's concerns, arguing that his physical presence would send a message about the resilience of Blackwood Ranch and its owner. They traveled with a small escort of ranch hands, including Armstrong, whose watchful presence kept Victor from overexerting himself on the trail. The hearing itself was anticlimactic after all they had endured. With the Pinkerton detectives' evidence and the testimonies of neighboring ranchers who had also suffered from the Prescott's manipulations, the new judge ruled decisively in Blackwood's favor. The water rights were confirmed, ensuring the ranch's survival for generations to come. As they left the courthouse, Victor leaning on Ellie's arm more heavily than he would admit, a town crier was announcing the latest news. The Prescott brothers had been formally indicted on multiple charges, their empire crumbling as former allies rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. "Justice," Victor murmured, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Of a sort," Ellie agreed, helping him into their waiting wagon. "Though it won't bring back those who died at their hands." Victor's expression sobered. "No, Samuel and the others deserved better." He squeezed her hand gently. "But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The land they loved will be protected." The return journey to Blackwood Ranch was taken at a leisurely pace, allowing Victor to rest and Ellie to gather herbs she spotted along the trail. They camped under star-filled skies, planning for the future, while the embers of their fire glowed orange against the darkness. The eastern pasture could be converted to wheat, Victor suggested one evening as they studied a map of the ranch spread across their laps. "If we rotate crops there, it would provide additional security against drought years." "And we could expand the orchard," Ellie added, tracing the area with her finger. "Fruit trees would do well in that sheltered valley, and we could preserve the harvest for winter." Victor caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Listen to us," he said with a smile. "Planning as if we have all the time in the world." "Why shouldn't we?" Ellie challenged gently. "The future belongs to those who prepare for it, my father always said." Victor's smile turned wistful. "I wish I could have known your family." "They would have liked you," Ellie assured him. "Especially my grandmother. She always said I needed someone stubborn enough to match me." His laugh echoed in the quiet night. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not, but I'll take it." They arrived back at Blackwood Ranch on a perfect autumn day. The aspen trees on the surrounding hills turned to gold by the changing season. The ranch hands had prepared a celebration to mark their victory at the hearing, and the main house was filled with music and laughter well into the evening. As the festivities wound down, Ellie found herself on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the deepening blue of the sky. Victor joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the growing chill. "Happy?" he asked, his arm settling comfortably around her waist. "Content," she replied thoughtfully. "It's not quite the same thing." "No," he agreed. "Happiness comes and goes like the weather. Contentment has deeper roots." Ellie leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her side. "My roots are here now," she said softly. "With you, with this land." Victor's arm tightened around her. "Then I have something to ask you." He turned her gently to face him, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the house. "I know we've spoken of partnership, of building a future together, but I find I want the formality of the question as well as the substance of the answer." Ellie's breath caught as he took her hands in his. "Victor, Eleanor Campbell," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "When I found you on the road that day, you had no name, at least not to me, no family, and it seemed no future. Now you have made a name for yourself here, found a family among these people, and I hope glimpsed a future worth claiming." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Will you marry me? Not out of gratitude or obligation, but because you choose this life, this land, this man, with all his flaws and limitations?" Ellie felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so complete it bordered on pain. "Yes," she said simply, "I choose all of it, limitations and all." Their wedding took place the following spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the ranch in a riot of color. It was a simple ceremony, attended by everyone at Blackwood and many from the surrounding ranches and towns. People whose respect Victor had earned through years of fair dealing, and whose affection Ellie had won, through her skill as a healer and her genuine care for their well-being. Josephine, who had permanently transferred her allegiance from the Prescotts to Blackwood Ranch, oversaw the preparations with military precision, transforming the main house into a bower of freshly cut flowers and greenery. Armstrong, standing as Victor's best man, managed to shed a tear during the vows despite his gruff exterior. As they exchanged rings beneath an arch of aspen branches, Ellie marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. The flood that had taken everything had also, in its terrible way, delivered her to this new life, one richer and more purposeful than she could have imagined in the dark days after her loss. "I once told you that I was getting the better end of our arrangement," Victor murmured, as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "I stand by that assessment." Ellie smiled up at him, noting the healthy color in his face, the clear eyes that watched her with undisguised adoration. "Then we'll have to agree to disagree, Mr. Blackwood, because I'm quite certain I'm the fortunate one." The years that followed were not without challenges. Victor's illness waxed and waned, sometimes confining him to bed for days at a time, other times receding enough to allow him to ride the boundaries of his beloved ranch and participate fully in its operations. Ellie's remedies, combined with the treatments recommended by doctors they consulted in Denver and even once in San Francisco, kept the worst symptoms at bay far longer than anyone had thought possible. They expanded the ranch's operations to include the wheat fields and orchard they had planned, providing income and security beyond the cattle that had always been its mainstay. Under their joint stewardship, Blackwood Ranch became known not just for the quality of its stock, but for its innovations in sustainable land management, techniques that preserved the water and soil for future generations. Children came first, a daughter with Victor's storm-grey eyes and Ellie's determined spirit, then twin boys who approached the world with complementary personalities, one cautious and thoughtful, the other bold and adventurous. Victor taught them to ride almost before they could walk, while Ellie passed on her grandmother's knowledge of healing plants and the body's mysteries. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the landscape, in shades of amber and gold, Victor took Ellie's hand in his, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Tying your life to mine, to this place?" Ellie turned to study his face, still handsome despite the lines etched by time and occasional pain. "Never," she said with the simple certainty that had always characterized her feelings for him. Not for a single moment. His smile, warm and genuine, was her reward. "Nor I," he assured her. "Every day with you has been a gift I never expected to receive." As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began their nightly procession overhead, Ellie leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that whatever the future held, joy or sorrow, ease or hardship, they would face it together on this land that had claimed them both. She had arrived at Blackwood Ranch with no name, no family, no future, a blank slate washed clean by tragedy. Now her name was known and respected throughout the territory, her family extended beyond blood to include every person who called. This ranch home, and her future, while not infinite, was rich with purpose and love. It was more than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up. Just click and check them out.